Hiya, and welcome to Unpack and See, where I open kits and art supplies, see what I can make with them, and give you my honest opinion. Today we're opening two. The first is a Disney Stitch designer vinyl. It comes with 3 markers. Yeah. I'm going to be using something completely different, and that's the second item I'm opening for this video. The Castle Arts 48 count acrylic paint set. Let's have a look at the paints first. And now it's time for a storybook segue. The Case of the Mistaken Synonym. Days wanted to get her daughter Kuro a very special birthday present. She's a professional artist and illustrator branching out into model and miniature painting, such as Gundams and Warhammer figures. But since this was a gift, Days didn't want to give away the surprise by asking her specifically which paint she used. Thus, in the wee hours of the morning, with only the glow of the computer screen and her memory of the conversations about all the new supplies she was now using, or wanted, and mistook Castle for Citadel.
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious, and don't call me Shirley.
Yet once realizing that these were not the paints she was looking for, corrected the oversight, and we now have new stuffs to play with. Because in this house, no art supply goes returned. Thank you for listening to Storytime Segue. I now return you to the video already in progress. I'll get back to the paints in just a minute. First, let's have a look at this Stitch figure. I really like the sculpt. He's so cute. And the figure itself has a little bit of a texture to it.
Nope.
So hopefully the paint will stick to it. Has an opening in the bottom that looks kind of like a bank, and not gonna lie,
A little longer than a few minutes later.
it was difficult to get off, but I had to get that open. Alright, back to the paints. I'm using the box the figure came in to kind of color match. I'm not going to be swatching all of these out. This is, to me, a very expensive kit that I'm not going to just go and waste these. I'm used to paying 99 cents for a bottle of folk art at the Walmart, okay? So I'm just going to be opening the ones that I'm going to use. Ultimately, I went with cobalt blue, Prussian blue, and sky blue for his body, cadmium yellow for the pineapple, magenta for the inside of the mouth, raw sienna for my main brown, French violet for the inside of his ears, and permanent green for the leaves on the pineapple. I also used titanium white, but I chose not to use the black in this set because I really like the plaid leather paint for really glossy eyes. So I did cheat a little there. That's okay, it's my art and I can do that if I want to. Let me say right up front that I'm going to be using these paints how I assume they're intended to be used. Nowhere in the booklets that came in the set specifically state on what medium these paints will work. However, in this highly detailed 5-step tutorial,
Wow, sarcasm. That's original.
the initial step does say to draw the outline on a gesso primed canvas. I decided to mix a little gesso into this paint, both to lighten the color and to give it a little bit more chance of sticking to this vinyl. When I use acrylic paints on the toys that I repaint, sometimes the paint sticks and sometimes it doesn't. Gesso helps, just so you know. I also thinned it down with a bit of water, which I find helps cut down on the brush stroke showing. and I'm using that on the beach portion, and I'm also going to use that on the pineapple just for a base coat. It has a good golden undertone which will go well with the yellow. I'm going to dry brush on top of it. I even painted underneath even though I didn't need to. For the base coat on the body, I mixed the cobalt blue with the gesso. I'm really impressed with the first layer of coverage. Now we wait for it to dry. Once it had, I did a little more painting off camera. The green on the pineapple leaves, the black of his eyes, and inside his mouth. And I put down the first layer of the French violet in his ears, but that was very translucent. I didn't add gesso to that one because I didn't want it to build up too much thickness inside his ear. Guess that means more layers of French violet. Now here's where the fun begins. I switched over to my pastels. Don't get me wrong, it's all fun, but I really like doing the shading. I noticed a bit of a glossy finish to the paint after it dried, so I was a bit concerned it wasn't going to grab it without needing a layer of clear sealant on it first. But I went ahead and scraped out a darker blue and a darker brown. And I'm just going in and dry brushing this into the creases of the pineapple and the body eventually. I really did like this sculpt because the lines in it were really nice and deep, so I could get a really good shade in there.
That's what she said. Ha! I don't get it.
This is when I noticed the pastels were sticking in some areas but not in others. That normally doesn't happen until after you've applied a clear sealant. So I'm not sure if that came from a thinner layer of base paint underneath, or if it was the vinyl reacting to the paint.
The world may never know.
That didn't seem to be happening with the blue. It was taking really well. So much so that once I had barely any left on my brush, I ran it over the entire area and it kind of brightened it all up. I don't know how else to explain it. Hopefully I don't lose that effect under the clear sealant. That can happen sometimes. It does dull it out, which is why you have to put on more layers of pastel and then sealant. Pastel and then sealant. Rinse and repeat. Before I put on that first layer, however, I want to try out my pencils. So I used a really light blue Lyra pencil and filled in his belly and around his eyes. Also, when you sharpen these pencils, save your shavings because you can put them in your palette, add a little water. That way, if you do want to use them as a paint, you don't have to wet the tip of your pencil. I didn't notice much scraping, but I did notice it was coming off grainy. Oh, you noticed that too? I did lose some of the shading to the 2 layers of spray sealant, but I'm gonna add more layers so it's okay. I mixed Prussian blue with titanium white for the darker areas on his nose and on his toe beans and his back striping, which for some strange reason I didn't film. Sorry. The pencil was not covering up the black I had used on the eye very well, that I ended up using sky blue mixed with a bit of titanium white for around his eyes and belly. It looked like it was covering up that black pretty good, and I did end up going over the entire eye just to see if it would stay as opaque as this when it was dry. And I'm happy to report that it did. Next, I wanted to see how these paints would hold up with sponge painting. It's a method I fall back on whenever I want texture in landscapes, like in this case, the beachfront. Used a makeup sponge that was a little damp and just patted that all over the ground. Doing it this way, the paint was thin enough to let that undercolor come through, and it gave it a really nice sand effect. And I also sponged the pineapple. This technique may get a little messy, but it is fun and relaxing. I painted the inside of the mouth with some muted down magenta. I mixed in some of the leftover blue. And for the teeth, I used the medium point jelly roll. It dries opaque, and it's much easier to work with than a teeny tiny paintbrush. And it's helpful that this is a very raised sculpt. And of course, going back over his eyes with the black leather paint. Quick PS with this paint, a little goes a long way. Now let's talk about these ears. The paint was so light it was not covering up the blue as well as I would have liked. But what I did was kind of went back and forth between the white and the blue and did more of what I would call a feathering technique. I used a dry brush, but unlike a dry brush technique, I load the brush with more paint. And I start in the center and brush out towards the edge. Being these are thinner layers, you're more likely to see brush strokes. So by pushing them out in the way that they would go in the ear, I think makes it look more natural. So I feather the violet from the inside out and the blue from outside in. And it creates a great feathered gradation where the two colors meet. In my opinion anyway. And finally onto the leaves of the pineapple, which I had been using as one of the two handholds on this piece while I was painting the rest of it. This is where I noticed that strange finish to this paint that I was talking about earlier. Like it had that plasticky, smooth,
what the French call a certain, I don't know what.
Using the paint right out of the tube was so streaky, not to mention as dark as what this pigment is. For it to come out as translucent as what it did, I'm very disappointed. It was as if it was a glaze and not a paint. That's okay though, I'm not going to let it stop me because I'm going to make up for it by throwing a couple of coats of clear sealant on top. And now it's back to my favorite pastels. I've gone with an even darker blue, and because it's a little bright, I wanted to mix in some gray. But this didn't look like gray to start with. I thought it was green, but it's gray. Just swirl it with the end of my paintbrush there. And I start at the bottom and work my way up, as that's where the darkest shadows would be. I'm using a stiff angle brush for this, as I'm really wanting to lay this color down. So I push the color into the recess and then feather back out into lighter. Much the same as I did with the ears. Think of it as directing light. When I get the look I'm going for, or I notice the surface is no longer accepting the pastels, it's time for a few coats of clear sealant. Let's talk about sealants for a moment. I use the Krylon Matte Finish clear sealant. I know a lot of other creators I've watched on YouTube use the Mr. Super Clear. Currently, the Krylon Matte Finish 11-ounce can is $5.12 at the Walmart. Mr. Super Clear, the UV Cut Flat Spray, is a 5.74 ounce can for $16.24.
Come on, man.
Not gonna happen. I tend to put on a lot of thin layers when I'm repainting, and I just could not afford to keep up with that. I use this spray in my sketchbook because it's archival, meaning it's UV resistant and non-yellowing. I figured what the heck and tried it out on my toy repaints, and I've had great luck. So for that price, I'm not switching anytime soon.
The trash heap has spoken. Yeah.
Luckily, with this dark green pastel, I was able to overcome the streakiness of that darker green paint. Again, pressing it deep in the grooves and feathering it back out towards the lighter parts. The coat of spray sealant definitely helped this stick better. I followed that up with light green on the tips and used a soft makeup brush to blend it all out. I rested his head on my arm to avoid touching the pastel on the leaves while shading more of his belly before the next coat of sealant. I used a Q-tip to really emphasize the bumps on the pineapple with this bright yellow pastel. It was just really difficult to film with how close I had to hold it to be able to see it, so I'm sorry. Filming art is hard. And even though I've been raving about how glossy this black is, no eye would be complete without eye shines. I had thought to do a more elaborate shine, but I'm glad I went with the minimal 1 dot each. Let's have a quick chit chat about the review part of this video. As far as the design of vinyl kit, I don't have any complaints. I think the $5 price point was definitely worth it, although I don't recommend using the markers in it. In regard to the paints, I still would not spend this much money on paint, but it did exactly what it was supposed to do. I'm still a little concerned with how transparent some of them were, and that strange finish after it dried with a couple of the colors. But maybe it was something I did, so I don't want to condemn it for that. Not to mention, you don't need to use a whole lot, so this kit's going to last quite a while. I did finish him off with about 3 coats of the clear sealant just to make sure nothing was going to come off. And I absolutely love how he turned out. He's so gosh darn cute. If you've made it all the way to the end, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it inspires you to do something creative too. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.